everybody, my name is Michelle and this is What Not to Do, the series where I talk about all of the problems that I've run into during the process of editing my book because of mistakes I made either in the planning process or while writing my novel. And last week I talked about building characters and how to build well-rounded, complex characters instead of one-dimensional ones. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up today, because in today's video I'm going to talk about what you do if you've already started your novel, or if you're like me and you've finished your first draft and now you're editing your novel and you're running into all of these kinds of problems because of the fact that you didn't build your characters properly the first time. So here we go. Rushing through the character creation process. So what I ended up doing is I did the first thing I said not to do. Instead of looking at my characters as a whole picture and trying to kind of get a feel for them that way and then developing outwards, I was so overconfident because of the fact that these are characters I've had history with from my dreams and from games and stuff of that nature, that I just rushed into writing down the specifics and not thinking about them as a whole. So what went wrong? Boredom. I ended up writing down details for characters without thinking about how important is this character to my story. I just basically had a list of like 50 or so questions, and I was like, hair color, eye color, blah, 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 blah. And I got bored of the process. For example, I have a character that is in one of the early chapters in my novel, and she is only in that chapter. And even in that chapter, she has like, 6 lines? And I started writing out this complicated list about her, and I got so tired and I felt like I was doing homework. I was just like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. And I just stopped. I didn't just stop with her. I stopped entirely. I just figured, you know what? I'll just figure it out as I go along. Consistency problems. Now this is something I talked about in my world building video because it is just as relevant for world building as it is for character building. Because of the fact that I decided to not write down all of those details and not go through the steps properly, I ran into problems of forgetting details. Forgetting what someone's hair color was, or maybe just the shape of their hair, or forgetting a character's full name, because for most of the book, that character's only referred to by their first name because they're talking to friends. But at certain points, if they're talking to, let's say, an official or somebody with some sort of, specific relationship where they would talk to them more professionally, I would forget what is their full name. And I would have to go back through the book to the different pages and look for those details. This problem didn't really affect my main cast very much because I had them pretty well defined in my mind. Even though I didn't write down those details for them as much as I should have, I at least had a basis to go off of. But what about the other characters? Those characters that pop in for a couple of lines now and again, or someone that you might run into, in one chapter and not see again for 5 or 6 chapters down the line. Well, that's where I started running into this problem. For example, I had a specific character who, when I first wrote her in my novel, I decided she was going to have a military background. And with that comes specific kinds of appearances, personality, demeanor, the way she holds herself. I had a specific image of her in my mind, and I wrote her that way. However, later on, when her character showed back up again, I forgot that that's what I intended. And I ended up with a completely different personality and everything, but with the same name. What I mean is, the first time she showed up, she was, very together, very organized, tough. She was assertive. She could speak clearly and plainly to, respond when directly asked questions. And when I wrote her in the second time, she was meek and shy and cowardly. and really kind of shriveled into herself when she was engaging with anybody with authority, which completely did not make sense for how I had already written her. It was a consistency problem, and I ended up having to sit down and say, okay, which of these two people, which of these two personalities is the one she's going to have? Which of these two appearances? Because yes, her appearances were different in both versions too. You see? Yeah, I messed up. No motivations. Because I was forgetting details, because I skipped so much of the process and how I should have done things, I found that a lot of my characters didn't have any motivations or goals to kind of drive them forward. And before I knew it, I had flat, dull, boring characters that really didn't have anything about them that differentiated them from the other characters. They didn't have a reason for doing the things they did. It's just plot says do this, so they did this. And what you end up with when you have that is you end up with passive characters. And what that is you have passive characters and active characters. Active characters actively do things which cause plot to continue forward. They make choices, sometimes the right one, sometimes the wrong one. And passive characters just kind of follow the flow of things. The group says, hey, we're going over there, and the passive character just follows them along. And that's what I ended up running into, because I didn't have any motivations or goals for my characters to kind of help guide me into what makes them tick. My characters were listless. They were just kind of floating along the story with no ambitions, no drives, no motivations. They had no depth. And what motivations and goals and fears and things of that nature add to your character is direction. It helps you think about how your characters are going to proceed, or how they're going to communicate, or how they're going to react to the different plots that you have in your book based off of them, based off of, them being people and not a list of characteristics. Lack of voice. And when I say lack of voice, I don't mean their physical voice, like the sound of their voice. Although it is important to know if they have a raspy voice or if they have a sultry voice. It's important to know that kind of thing too. But I mean the way they speak, the way they carry themselves. That really matters for how you write for your characters, especially if it's a main character, because typically you're writing from their perspective, or you're writing in a way that kind of demonstrates their perspective, and knowing how they think about the world around them and the people around them really impacts how you should write that character and their experiences. And by not knowing their voice, because I don't know their motivations and I didn't write down any details about them, I really kind of screwed myself, to put it bluntly. My characters kind of ended up blurring together, and I couldn't sit down and read a section of my book where I have multiple characters interacting and tell one from the other without straight up looking at their names to see who it was speaking. And that's not what you want, because if you have on one hand a classist woman who looks down at everyone around her that is not of her social standing, and you have on the other hand a girl from a modest upbringing who's had to work for everything she has, they're going to speak differently. They're going to dress differently. They're going to carry themselves differently. And that adds into their voice, because they're going to use different type of vocabulary, different kinds of slang maybe. And not knowing their voice and telling the differences between their voice makes it to where it sounds like it's all one character with a bunch of different names. I would struggle with certain scenes that involved characters I didn't have fleshed out, because I would try to write the scene and then rewrite the scene and rewrite the scene again because it wasn't clicking. Something wasn't right to me. And what wasn't right to me is that the character wasn't right to me. And I would spend weeks on this just trying to get one scene done, and it was excruciating to deal with. The solution. So, what do you do to fix the problem? Well, first of all, don't do what I did. Because what I did is I decided I'm just going to finish writing the whole book and then I'll go back and fix the problems later. I told myself the important thing is just to get the book done. And that's true to an extent. Writing the book is important because you can world build and character build all day long, but if you don't actually sit down and write the book, you don't have a novel. But you also need to do the work to get the preparation done. And so by me just waiting until I had completely finished the book and then go back to try to fix it during editing, what I'm running into is I'm having to rewrite almost every single chapter of my book because I have to fix so many problems with so many characters and I have to flesh out all of these details with all of these characters. So don't do that. So how do you fix it? Well, what you need to do first is stop. Stop writing, stop editing, stop where you are, put it to the side, and just sit and think for a minute. Okay? Now, once you're kind of there, then what you need to do is you need to take inventory of what details you do have. Make a list. I use the spreadsheet personally, but you can use any sort of way that you use for keeping record of things, whether that is an online program or if you use just a word pad, whatever it is, you need to take inventory of each character and how much details you have. Go back through your book, look through character by character every time you describe someone, every time you go over a personality trait or a detail or something like that, something important, jot it down and make sure you keep record of that for when you proceed forward. Then it's time for you to start fleshing out your characters. Start the process the way I talked about it in my last video. Start broad, okay? You have some details there, so you've already given this a lot of thought, or in my case, a little thought, and start with that and then build outwards. Start going through it and going through the process and thinking about their motivations, their goals, their details, and start writing it down. And once you get their details written down and you get them kind of fleshed out a little bit, then you can start thinking, okay, is this going to change anything I've already written? If so, make a note. You don't need to go back and fix anything at this point, but you should keep a list. Keep a list of problems that you're going to go back and fix when you get to the editing phase. And once you have this done, then you can start picking back up and continuing with the rest of your novel if you haven't finished writing your first draft. That way, from here out, you will have that consistency, which will save you some headache when you go back to the editing phase and you start back at the beginning, because now you have this list and you can say, okay, I need to fix Sasha's hairstyle. I need to fix Christian's attitude with this. I have to make sure Angelica says something along the lines of this. Whatever it is, you've made yourself a list so you have a starting point for fixing the problems. That'll make it easier for you when you're doing your editing. And you may need to make changes, but really it is a lot easier to make those changes when you realize that you have a problem, rather than waiting until you finish the entire book and then having to start from scratch like I did. Because if I would have, the second I realized I had a problem, which was probably about chapter 10 in my novel, I realized that this wasn't working. If I would have stopped then and fleshed out my characters and really thought about things, I could have fixed a bunch of problems, and that way from chapter 11 on, things would have been a lot smoother, and then I'm only having to go back and fix, like major fix, chapters 1 through 10. Instead of, like I did, where now I'm having to major fix chapters 1 through however many chapters I have. I don't remember. Just trust me. think about these things and you can save yourself a lot of headache. In an ideal world, I would have planned out my details for my character and I would have gone through the process the right way from the beginning before I started writing my book, but then I wouldn't have the series because, you know, I wouldn't have messed up so much. All right, guys. So, like I said before, check out my first video, the part 1, where I talk about how to do it the right way. I will link that below. And also check out any of my other videos. I talk about world building, I talk about plotting, and I'm just kind of here to talk about how I screwed up. So, yeah. All right. Bye-bye.